There's new concern tonight over the safety of Missouri's water. Some state lawmakers want to put limits on which water sources fall under the Clean Water Act. Joe McLean reports on the impact of these proposed policies.
These bills would reduce the scope of the Department of Natural Resources' reach by changing the term bodies of surface and subsurface water to ponds and defining pond in a far more specific way. It means that the state would have fewer bodies of water that it oversees and manages. Susan Fair describes herself as a grassroots clean water advocate, strongly opposing the bills.
They would take away the Missouri Department of Natural Resources' ability to regulate discharge of wastewater into wetlands, wells, and streams, and negatively impact groundwater.
When the bills were heard in committee, they got strong support from industry groups that stood to be regulated, like the Missouri Farm Bureau, Missouri Soybeans, and the Missouri Pork Producers. The president of Associated Industries of Missouri said, quote, "This is important in determining whether or not any discharge coming from a manufacturer is regulated or requires a permit, etc. The EPA had previously sought a more stringent definition for purposes of federal environmental law, and we want to be sure the state of Missouri does not take a similar approach." Many others, mainly environmental and conservation groups, came out in opposition to the deregulation, including the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, and the Conservation Federation of Missouri. Doug Doty is a farmer in Livingston County.
This regressive legislation threatens landowner protections in our clean water law.
And Fair says she's determined to push back against these bills.
It's just one more step in chiseling away common sense regulations of clean water, our environment, public health.
Both the House and Senate bills would still need to be approved by their committees, and there are only 8 weeks of session remaining. In Jefferson City, I'm Joe McLean.